She was 21 years old and had just been kicked out. Not with a shouting match or a slammed door, but with a calculated, cold silence and a single $1 bill taped to the back of a Greyhound bus ticket. Elena Thorne suffered from a rare autoimmune disease that made the sun her greatest enemy. It was a cruel cosmic irony for a girl now standing on the jagged edge of the Arizona desert. Her skin was a map of old scars and new fears, reacting to the ultraviolet light as if it were a physical flame. With the last of her strength and that single crumpled dollar, she had done the unthinkable. She brought the deed to a crumbling, sun-bleached apothecary in a ghost town near the Superstition Mountains. The roof was a jagged skeleton of scorched timber that whistled in the dry wind. The windows were opaque and blind, coated with decades of baked sandstorms and forgotten dreams. The local land office had warned her that the structure was nothing more than a hot box for a slow, agonizing death. But what nobody knew was that inside a small amber tincture jar, something had been waiting for a century. It wasn't a remedy, and it wasn't a poison. It was a secret sealed in heavy, dark wax that would do more than just mend her broken body. It would change the history of the desert and the weight of her future forever. Before we continue, if stories of the forgotten being found mean something to you, please take a moment to subscribe. It tells the algorithm that these quiet roads and the people walking them are worth remembering. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? We love seeing how far these echoes reach across the world. Elena stood on the sagging porch, her body vibrating with the effort of remaining upright. She was covered from head to toe in heavy, breathable linen wraps, despite the 100-degree heat. The shimmering haze of the desert made the horizon look like liquid fire, dancing on the grave of the town. The air smelled of burnt sage, ancient parched dust, and the sharp tang of impending ozone. She heard the dry, rhythmic rattle of a snake vibrating somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. The apothecary didn't just sit there in the sand, it braced itself against the light. It had held its breath for 70 long years, squinting its window eyes against the relentless glare. It was waiting for a pair of hands that didn't fear the darkness or the secrets kept within. As she turned the heavy iron key, she felt a strange electric resistance in the lock. The clerk at the county office had mentioned a strange clause buried in the 1920 fine print of the deed. The building was under a perpetual custodianship, a legal term that had long since fallen out of common use. She hadn't just bought a pile of rotting wood and glass for a single $1. She had inherited a duty to a ghost who refused to leave his station. Elena pushed the door open, and the desert's gold was swallowed by a hungry, waiting shadow. This was her new world, bought with $1 and a desperate need to disappear. Elena was born into a family that worshipped the high noon sun of Phoenix. Her father was a real estate mogul who sold glass skyscrapers that reflected the sky. Her mother was a socialite who measured her worth by the brilliance of her garden parties. In their world, light was everything. It was status, it was power, and it was clarity. But when Elena was 6, her body began to rebel against the very thing her parents loved. A simple afternoon at the pool would leave her skin covered in angry, weeping blisters. Doctors called it solar urticaria, a rare and violent physical allergy to ultraviolet rays. To her parents, the diagnosis wasn't just a medical tragedy. It was a strategic blemish on their carefully curated image of a perfect golden family. They began to treat her like a broken asset, a liability tucked away in the corners of their mansion. She spent her teenage years in darkened basements and rooms with thick velvet curtains. She became a ghost in a house made of glass, watching the world through tinted windows. Her father used to say that a system is only as good as its most reliable part. He looked at his daughter and saw a part that had failed the assembly line. Elena learned to read the silence of her home better than she read her school books. She spent her nights studying the logic of systems in the library, trying to fix herself. If a machine stops, you find the gear that is jammed, the one that is stuck. But how do you fix a body that is trapped in a war with the sun? The tension in the Thorne household finally snapped on the morning of her 21st birthday. Her parents had planned a massive outdoor gala to celebrate her father's latest acquisition. They asked her to stay in the guest house, out of sight of the cameras and the guests. "It's better this way, Elena," her mother had said, avoiding her eyes. "People don't want to see a girl who has to hide from the very day we are celebrating." That afternoon, Elena walked into the main house, her skin wrapped in protective silk. She found her suitcase already packed and sitting on the marble floor of the foyer. Her father didn't look up from his ledger as he handed her the Greyhound ticket. "We've done all we can, but we can't live in a tomb just because you have to." There was no shouting, no tears, just the sound of a deadbolt sliding into place. She sat at the bus station for 12 hours, replaying their final conversation in a loop. Not because she wanted to hurt herself, but because she was trying to find the angle she missed. She realized then that discipline isn't just about following rules. It's about surviving a design that was never built to include you. She was lost in the glare of their success, a shadow looking for a place to finally land. When she saw the listing for the $1 apothecary, she felt a pull from the deep desert. It was a ruin, a failure, and a discarded piece of history, just like her. She didn't cry as the bus pulled away from the city lights of Phoenix. She simply tightened the wraps around her hands and looked toward the dark mountains. The desert was vast, empty, and full of secrets that only revealed themselves at night. The apothecary didn't just sit there in the shifting sands. It watched her. It held its breath for 70 long years, its wooden joints groaning like a weary sentinel waking from a fever dream. The building was a skeleton of scorched timber and sun-bleached stone, its ribs exposed to the unforgiving Arizona sky. It felt like a living thing, a silent guardian that had spent decades squinting its window eyes against the relentless glare. Elena stepped over the threshold, moving from the blinding fire of the porch into a hungry, waiting shadow. The hinges of the door screamed, a high metallic wail that felt like a final warning to the living. Inside, the air was unmoving and heavy, possessing the density of cold water at the bottom of a forgotten well. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of sharp iron, parched cedar, and the peppery ghost of dried belladonna. Dust motes danced in the rare shafts of light that pierced the holes in the roof. They created a cage of gold bars across the floorboards, trapping the history of the room in columns of fire. The silence here was not empty. It was a physical presence that pressed against her eardrums like a weight. She stood still for a long minute, letting the darkness wrap around her linen-clad shoulders like a protective shroud. Her skin, so sensitive to the touch of light, finally stopped its frantic, invisible crawling. She felt the house settle around her, a sigh of settling timber that vibrated through the thin soles of her boots. The main room was a graveyard of medicine, with hundreds of glass jars standing in rows like forgotten soldiers. Their labels were yellowed and brittle, curling away from the glass like the dead skin of a desert reptile. She moved her hand along the main counter, leaving a clean, dark trail in a layer of grey grime 3 inches thick. The wood beneath was mahogany, dark and rich, far too expensive for a simple shop in a small mining town. As she moved toward the rear laboratory, she found the first evidence of Silas Vane's deep-seated paranoia. The internal doors were not made of wood alone. They were reinforced with hidden steel plates and hand-forged bolts. The locks were massive, industrial-grade mechanisms that required a heavy key and a stronger will to turn. This was a bunker disguised as a place of healing, a fortress built against the intrusion of the world. She realized then that the previous owner had spent his life in fear of the very light she was currently hiding from. He hadn't built this place to welcome customers. He had built it to survive a siege that never came. A rhythmic thumping came from the walls, the sound of a loose shutter beating against the stone like a dying heart. Elena touched a row of cobalt jars, their cold glass biting into her fingertips with a sudden sharp chill. The building seemed to lean toward her in the gloom, as if sharing a secret it had kept for 100 years. She was no longer just a girl looking for a roof and a place to hide her scars. She was a shadow that had finally found its proper place in a kingdom of dust. The apothecary was a sanctuary for the discarded, and she was its new, unintended queen. Silas Vane was a man of the earth long before he became a man of glass and shadows. In the late 1890s, he had been a lone prospector wandering the jagged canyons of the Superstition Mountains. He wasn't looking for the predictable yellow glint of gold that drove most men to madness and murder. He found something far more dangerous, a vein of stone that pulsed with a deep, visceral crimson. They were pigeon blood rubies, a rare and ancient fire trapped within the cold grip of the mountain. In a frontier town where life was cheap and greed was a sharp knife, Silas knew his discovery was a death sentence. He watched as other miners were followed into the sagebrush, their claims stolen before the ink on the deeds was dry. Silas realized that to keep his fortune, he had to become someone the world was afraid to touch. He traded his pickaxe for a mortar and pestle and built the apothecary on the edge of the desert. He didn't fill his shelves with tonics for the heart or balms for the skin. He filled them with the scent of cyanide, the bitterness of strychnine, and the reputation of a man who died in death. He became the ghost, a man of poisons who sat in a dark room while the world passed him by. Elena found his secret ledger tucked into a hollowed-out space beneath the heavy mahogany counter. The cover was cracked leather that smelled of ancient sweat, dried tobacco, and something sharply acidic. The paper was so brittle it made a sound like a breaking winter leaf as she turned the pages. The ink had faded to a ghost gray, written in a technical, slanted hand that mirrored the discipline of a scientist. As Elena read, she realized this wasn't a record of medical transactions or chemical experiments. It was a masterfully designed system of obfuscation that turned gemstones into botanicals. Every entry for belladonna corresponded to a specific carat weight of a raw ruby. Each gram of aconite marked the clarity and purity of a stone pulled from the deep earth. Silas had spent 30 years recording the growth of a fortune while pretending to sell jars of poison. He had lived in the dark to protect his light, hiding his treasure in the very bottles people were too terrified to open. Elena felt a sudden sharp chill crawl up her spine, despite the stagnant Arizona heat. She looked at the rows of jars again, seeing them not as junk, but as the iron bars of a cell Silas had built for himself. He was a man who understood that silence is the only armor that never rusts. She recognized the geometry of his fear because it was the same map she had been forced to follow. He had chosen the shadows to survive. She had been born into them to endure. Suddenly, the loose shutter outside slammed against the wall with the force of a gunshot. The sound echoed through the hollow building, making Elena drop the ledger onto the dusty floor. As the book hit the wood, a small silver key slid out from between the back pages and skittered across the planks. It stopped in a pool of moonlight that had just begun to crawl across the laboratory floor. The key was shaped like a serpent, its eyes made of tiny, dull red stones that seemed to blink in the shifting light. Elena reached for it, her fingers trembling as she realized the system was finally inviting her in. The ghost was dead, but his bunker was still very much alive. Elena began the meticulous work of restoration under the cool silver protection of the moon. She became a shadow moving through shadows, her world coming alive only when the sun surrendered to the horizon. She didn't have the money for industrial solvents or modern power tools. She had only her father's technical grit and the logic of the grind to guide her through the dust. The air in the apothecary changed as she worked, shifting from stagnant rot to the sharp scent of rebirth. The technical process of mixing boiled linseed oil with pure turpentine to revive the parched mahogany. The wood was thirsty, drinking the oil until the deep wine-red grain began to pulse beneath her cloth. Every stroke of the rag was a conversation with the past, a way of proving that she was still useful. She used a fine grit pumice stone and a slurry of white vinegar to grind away the calcified sand on the window panes. The sound was a constant rhythmic rasping that echoed the scraping of her own anxieties against her ribs. Slowly, the opaque glass surrendered its secrets, becoming as clear and still as high mountain water. Maybe it was the way the moonlight finally found its way through the clean glass, painting the floor in silver. Maybe it was the way the wood seemed to warm under her touch, as if the apothecary were finally recognizing her. Maybe it was the way she realized that rust is not just iron oxide, it is the physical manifestation of time's tears. She learned to read the technical system of the building, just as her father had taught her to read an engine. If a floorboard groaned, it was a structural warning about a shifting foundation beneath the sand. If a hinge resisted, it was a plea for the alignment that only a drop of whale oil could provide. She spent hours on her knees, scrubbing the grout between the floor stones with a stiff wire brush. Her hands became a map of oil stains and salt-white calluses, but her heart felt lighter with every layer of grime she removed. Restoration isn't just about making something look new. It's about removing the noise until the original intention is heard. A system doesn't lose its purpose just because it is covered in a century of neglect. It only loses its voice. While she was patching a hole in the roof with sheets of corrugated tin, she noticed something extraordinary in the masonry. Embedded deep within the stones of the chimney were 3 perfectly cut glass prisms. They were angled with technical precision designed to catch the light of the moon at its highest point in the sky. As the moon aligned with the ridge of the Superstition Mountains, a beam of concentrated silver light shot down the flue. It didn't hit the hearth. It was reflected by a hidden mirror in the back of the fireplace. The light funneled through a gap in the floorboards, pointing like a spectral finger toward the darkest corner of the basement. Elena followed the light down the stone stairs, her breath hitching in the sudden electric silence of the cellar. The silver beam came to rest on a single isolated shelf that she had missed in her initial search. There, sitting alone in the spotlight of the moon, was a jar that looked different from all the others. It was a deep, hypnotic cobalt blue, its surface reflecting the light like a star fallen into the desert sand. The system was no longer just a building, it was a map, and she had just reached the first destination. The cobalt jar sat on the stone shelf like a throne. It was small, no larger than a standard tea tin, but it commanded the entire room. As Elena reached out, her fingers brushed against a thick grey crust of ancient spider webs. The air in the basement was frigid, smelling of damp limestone and the sharp ozone tang of the desert night. She wrapped her hands around the glass and pulled, expecting the light resistance of an empty vessel. The jar didn't budge. It felt as though it were anchored to the very center of the earth. Elena braced her feet against the uneven stone floor and pulled again with all her strength. It came away with a sudden heavy thud that vibrated through her arms and deep into her chest. The weight was impossible, far too dense for liquid, far too solid for herbs. It felt as if she were holding a concentrated piece of the mountain itself. She carried the jar to her moonlit workbench, the glass humming with a strange low frequency. The seal was not made of cork or simple wax like the hundreds of other bottles upstairs. It was a poured lead cap, grey and dull, fused to the cobalt rim with a layer of black beeswax. Whoever had closed this jar didn't want it opened by accident or by time. They had sealed it as if they were locking a soul inside a tomb. Maybe it was the way the cobalt glass seemed to swallow the moonlight instead of reflecting it. Maybe it was the way the silence of the room became so heavy it felt like a physical embrace. Maybe it was the way she realized that true value is never found in the things that are easy to carry. Elena grabbed the small wire brush to clear the debris from the base of the jar. As the dust fell away, she saw deep, deliberate grooves carved into the mahogany of the workbench. A single word had been etched into the wood, hidden beneath a century of grime until this very moment. It read, "Rebirth." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed the thumping of the loose shutter above. She wasn't looking for a payday anymore. She was looking for a mirror. She looked at her own linen-wrapped hands, scarred by a son that hated her, and then back at the word on the table. The system was no longer a machine or a building. It was a promise made by a dead man to a girl who had forgotten how to hope. The lead cap felt warm to the touch now, as if the jar were waking up in her presence. She reached for her small alcohol lamp, her hand steady for the first time in years. The darkness of the apothecary was no longer a cage. It was a laboratory for a miracle. Elena struck a match. The small blue flame of the alcohol lamp danced in the drafty cellar. It cast long, flickering shadows that looked like grasping fingers against the stone walls. She held the cobalt jar over the heat, her eyes fixed on the line where lead met glass. Technical description, using a thin steel spatula, to probe the softening seal. The air filled with the scent of ancient scorched honey and the metallic tang of heated lead. A soft hiss whispered through the room as the first bead of black wax liquefied. The world narrowed down to a single point of concentration and heat. The flame flickered, the metal groaned, the past began to bleed. Slowly the lead cap began to slide away from the rim of the jar. It didn't fall, it resisted, as if the vacuum inside were refusing to let go of its secret. Elena braced her thumbs and pushed with a steady, calculated pressure. The seal snapped with a sharp, crystalline crack that echoed like a bone breaking in the silence. She tipped the jar over the mahogany workbench, expecting a cloud of dust or a pool of black liquid. Instead, a cascade of raw, unpolished stones spilled out in a silent crimson flood. They weren't cut into facets, and they didn't sparkle like the jewelry in her mother's vault. They were deep, visceral, and pulsed with a light that seemed to come from a heart still beating. 24 pigeon blood rubies, each the size of a mountain berry, rolled across the wood. They glowed with a deep heat, like embers from a fire that had refused to go out for 100 years. Elena didn't scream or cheer. She stood perfectly still, her breath hitching in a throat that had gone suddenly dry. The sheer weight of the fortune was staggering, likely worth $2 million in the modern market. But she didn't see money. She saw the physical remains of Silas Vane's stolen life. These stones were the reason he had lived as a ghost. They were the reason he had built a fortress out of an apothecary and a prison out of his own silence. She reached out a linen-wrapped finger and touched the largest stone. It felt cold, yet it looked like it should burn through the table and into the floor. Maybe it was the way the red light stained her white bandages like fresh blood. Maybe it was the way the shadows in the room seemed to bow before the new light. Maybe it was the way she realized that her dollar had bought her the only thing her parents couldn't, a legacy. As the last ruby settled into a groove on the table, Elena noticed something else inside the jar. A tight roll of yellowed vellum was wedged into the bottom, protected by a layer of lamb's wool. She pulled it out with a pair of silver tweezers, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm. The ghost of the desert was finally ready to speak his truth. The vellum was rough and cool, possessing the texture of dried snakeskin beneath her fingertips. It smelled of cedar oil and the sharp, acidic bite of a century-old ink that had refused to fade. The handwriting was a series of elegant, jagged peaks, slanted as if a wind were blowing the words across the page. Elena leaned into the blue glow of her lamp, her pulse thumping against the collar of her linen wrap. The first line of the letter cut through the heavy silence of the cellar like a blade. To whoever finds this, my name is Silas Vane, and I have spent 40 years building a wall against the world that loves the light too much. He wrote of the days when he was a man of the mountain, a man who saw the earth bleed rubies while other men saw only dirt. He explained that he had lived in the dark, not because he hated the sun, but because he couldn't survive the greed that the sun revealed in others. The rubies were never meant to be a trophy. They were a security deposit for a future he would never see. These stones are the blood of the earth, pulled from a place where the sun has never reached. I have guarded them with the reputation of a poisoner, knowing that a man's fear is the only lock that cannot be picked. But you, the one who has looked past the rust and the dust of this ruin, have already proven you are not like the others. Elena felt a hot tear track through the grime on her cheek, soaking into the white fabric of her mask. She recognized the loss in his words, the total isolation of a human soul that has been forced to become a ghost to survive. If you are reading this, the apothecary is yours, but do not think of it as a shop. Think of it as a sanctuary for those the world has discarded as junk. But there is one more thing I kept for the end. Beneath the lamb's wool in the jar is a formula I found in the deep canyons where the night-blooming cactus grows. It was a medicine of the ancients, a balm for those whose skin cannot bear the touch of the high noon fire. Elena's breath hitched so sharply it felt like a physical blow to her chest. She looked back into the cobalt jar, her fingers frantic as she pulled away the soft yellowed wool. There, etched into a small silver plate, was a technical list of ingredients and a process of distillation. Silas Vane hadn't just left her a fortune in crimson stones. He had left her the rebirth of her own skin, a way to walk in the world without the armor of shadows. He had been waiting 100 years to give a daughter he never had, the life he never got to lead. Take care of the shadows, the letter concluded, for they are the only place where the truth can safely bloom. Elena didn't rush to the nearest jewelry store to cash in her newfound fortune. She spent the next year living in the quiet safety of the cellar, becoming a master of the very distillation system Silas had described on the silver plate. The technical process of extracting the clear, viscous oil from the night-blooming cactus using a vacuum-sealed glass retort. The essence smelled of heavy rain on hot stone and the cool electric sweetness of midnight. She applied the silver-tinted balm to her forearms, her face, and the hollow of her neck where the scars were deepest. For the first time since she was 6 years old, the crawling fire in her veins went silent. The rebirth was not just in her bank account, but in the very cells of her skin and the rhythm of her breath. She used the rubies to establish the Thorne Vein Foundation, a center dedicated to rare dermatological conditions. She didn't buy a glass mansion in Phoenix. She bought the entire ghost town and the mountains surrounding it. She constructed a massive underground greenhouse where rare shade-loving plants provided the base for modern healing. The apothecary was no longer a skeleton of scorched timber whistling in the desert wind. It was a beacon of polished, deep desert mahogany and gleaming cobalt glass that captured the stars. It became a place of pilgrimage for those whom the world had discarded as broken assets or junk. Her parents attempted to call her dozens of times when they saw her face on the cover of a major scientific journal. Elena didn't answer the phone, and she didn't replay the old conversations in her head anymore. She wasn't being cruel. She was simply no longer the person who needed their validation to exist. The system of her life had been restored to its proper alignment, and the friction of the past had been oiled away. That is the thing about the directions our lives are pulled in when we feel most alone. We often think we are being discarded when we are actually being relocated to where we are needed most. We think a loss is an end when it is often just the clearing of the ground for a rebirth. Whether it is a clock tower on a ridge, a boat on a bayou, or an apothecary in the Arizona desert, the form doesn't matter. What matters is whether you can stand inside the ruins of your own life and feel something settle in your chest, something that says, "This is the room that has been waiting for me. This is where I begin." Elena Thorne was 21 years old and homeless when she walked out of a house that didn't want her. She had $1 in her pocket and a skin that was terrified of the day. She bought a ruin and found a legacy that gave her back the world. It was the best dollar she ever spent. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear that it is never too late to start over. And tell us in the comments, what is the one ruin in your life that you are ready to restore?